She saved the Alpha's legendary white wolf, kept him alive 3 days in a frozen cave, with bleeding hands and a torn cloak and everything she had left. Then he vanished into the snow without once looking back. But the day they dragged her into that great stone hall, wrists bound, accused of a crime she never committed, ready to be judged by a room full of strangers who were already certain, that Wolf walked in, past the guards, past the kneeling crowd, past the throne itself, and he lay down at her feet. The whole hall stopped breathing, because a woman the world had thrown out into a storm to die was about to find out exactly what she was worth, and so was everyone who had ever looked away. Some people are called cursed simply because no one ever bothered to look closer, and what happens when someone finally does is a thing worth staying for. The snow came early that afternoon. Cora knew what it meant before anyone said a word. The sky had gone yellow at the edges, the color of an old bruise, and in these mountains, that color meant one thing: 3 days, at least, maybe more. She had grown up reading skies like this. She knew every warning the mountains bothered to give. The elders knew too. That was the cruel part. They gathered the whole settlement into the clearing while the snow was still soft, still falling like it meant no harm. Every face she had ever known stood in a loose circle, and every one of them was turned toward her. Thorn stood at the center, oldest of the elders, a man who never raised his voice because he never had to. "Cora of no line," he said, and his words carried easy across the wind. "You are called to answer." The boy had been gone 2 days. His name was Eli, 6 years old, always laughing, always slipping under fences he had no business near. The kind of child a whole pack loves without deciding to. And now the whole pack needed someone to blame. "The child vanished," Thorn went on the night you were seen near the far ridge. The cursed do not need to lift a hand. Their presence is enough." She opened her mouth. A younger man stepped in front of her before a single sound came out. Not rough. Just there. A body between her and any chance to speak. The message was clear enough. There was no defense they would hear. There never had been. Because Cora was the one born wrong. The one who never shifted. In a pack of wolves, she had come into the world and stayed a girl, year after year, while every child around her found their second shape and she found nothing. Wolfless. That was the polite word. Cursed was the one they used when they thought she couldn't hear. She had worn that word her whole life. She had learned to move through the settlement the way a shadow moves through a room. Small, quiet, easy to overlook. She had gotten very good at being easy to overlook. "The sentence is exile," Thorn said, "effective now." Now, with the sky already going dark, with 3 days of storm coming down the ridge like a fist, nobody moved to stop it. She looked around the circle, slow, searching. Some faces turned away, some didn't, and the ones that held her gaze weren't cruel, exactly. They were just certain. Certain she was what they said she was. Certain that being certain was the same as being right. They gave her a cloak. One cloak. Not her good one. The old gray thing with the torn hem she'd been meaning to mend for 2 winters. They let her take it from her own door. That was the mercy they offered. The gate opened. She walked through it. It closed behind her with a sound she felt more than heard. And that was all. She walked for a long time before the cold stopped feeling like cold. That was the thing nobody warned you about. At some point, the burning stops. The shivering stops. The snow starts to feel almost soft, almost kind, and a small, quiet voice in the back of the mind says, "Maybe you could just sit for a moment. Just rest." She knew that voice was lying. She kept her feet moving because stopping was the same as agreeing. There was another settlement, half a day east in good weather. She had been there once as a girl, holding her father's hand, back when her father was still a warm shape in the world, and not a name she carried like a stone. She wasn't sure the distance worked. Not in this. Not with the light already gone thin and gray. She fell the first time near a frozen creek. Got up. Fell again in a clearing she didn't know. Got up slower. The snow shaped itself around her each time she went down. Almost gentle. Almost like a bed. That's how it takes you, she thought. Not with pain, with comfort. She got up anyway. And then she heard it. A sound from somewhere in the dark trees. Not a howl. Not quite. Something between a howl and a cry. The kind of sound a living thing makes when it has been making that sound for a long, long time, and is starting to lose faith that anyone is left to hear it. She stopped. She could keep walking. That was the sane thing. She was half frozen already. No weapon. No shelter. No promise she'd live to see morning herself. Whatever was out there in the dark, it wasn't her problem. She stood very still in the falling snow. And then she turned toward the sound. If anyone had asked her why, she isn't sure she could have named it. Maybe because she knew what it was like to cry out into the dark and have no one come. She almost missed him. He was buried under the drift, and what she saw first wasn't a wolf at all. It was a wrongness in the white, a shape that didn't belong. Then she saw the iron, an old trap, the kind hunters set in autumn and sometimes forgot they'd set. Its jaws had closed high on his foreleg, and the snow all around him was packed down in a wide circle, then packed down again, and she understood without being told. He had been fighting it for hours. He was enormous. White fur nearly lost against the snow, so that only his eyes gave him away. Pale gold. Catching what little light came through the clouds and holding on to it. There was something in those eyes that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite fury. Something that lived in the narrow space between. He saw her. He lunged. The chain caught him 2 feet short of where she stood, and the iron bit deeper, and he snarled through the pain of it. She didn't run. She wasn't sure if that was courage, or if her legs had simply stopped listening to her. She stood there while he pulled and snapped and warned her with everything he had. And she looked past all of it, down at the trap, and she thought about what it would take to open those jaws. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said. He snarled. "I know you don't believe me. That's all right. You don't have to." She pulled the glove off her right hand. This cold hit her skin like a slap. Total. Immediate. She crouched low in the snow, keeping her eyes on his, and reached for the trap with fingers that were already going stiff and slow. He snapped at her. She pulled back, waited, reached again. The mechanism was old and frozen through, and her hands weren't working the way hands are supposed to. And twice she had to stop and breathe on her fingers just to bring the feeling back. He kept pulling, kept snarling, kept watching her with those burning gold eyes like he was waiting to understand what she wanted from him. She wanted nothing. That was the part he couldn't seem to place. It took a long time. When the jaws finally gave, when the iron came apart in her raw and bleeding fingers, he didn't run. He lay there in the snow with his hurt legs stretched out in front of him, and he looked at her. She looked back. "There," she said softly. She pulled her glove on over fingers that were bleeding now, cut where the metal had caught her. She hadn't even felt it happen. Two of them out here in the dark. The storm closing over the trees like a lid. The wolfless girl the whole pack had thrown away. And the great white wolf that something had left behind. Neither of them belonging anywhere. Both of them somehow still here. Far from the cave, past the ridge and the frozen creek and the black wall of the trees, the settlement of the pack had gone quiet. Not the quiet of sleep. The other kind. The kind that settles over a place when something at its center has slipped loose and left a hole where it used to be. In the great hall, a guard stood before the empty seat of the pack lord and made himself say the words he did not want to say. "He's gone. The white wolf is gone." No one answered. The fire in the great hearth cracked and settled into itself. Outside, the wind leaned on the stone walls like a thing trying to get in, and finding no way, howling instead. The white wolf did not go missing. That was the fact none of them could fit inside their heads. He had walked the far borders for years. Every night, every season, through storms worse than this one. He did not wander. He did not stray. He was the one certain thing in the whole territory, steady as the turning of the sky. And now the border stood empty, and the storm was burying every track he might have left, one white breath at a time. His name was Silas Kane. He had led this pack a long time. Long enough that most of the young ones had never known another lord. He had taken the seat after a season that had cost him nearly everything he had, and he had spent the year since holding a broken thing together with his bare hands. One piece at a time. One long night at a time. He was not a man who panicked. He was panicking now. Somewhere out in that white dark was the wolf who had come back from the worst of it and never quite come all the way home. The wolf who was strong and loyal and always there, and somehow still gone. A creature who did every duty asked of him and asked for nothing back, and who had not made one single sound of contentment in longer than Silas let himself count. Each morning he stood at the eastern window and told himself the wolf was the most capable thing in these mountains, that he had lived through far worse than a little weather. He told himself this many times a day. It helped almost not at all, because the truth, the one he did not say to the guards or the elders, the one he barely let himself think in the low hours, was that the wolf and the man were not two things. They never had been. He had come back changed. That was how the pack said it, on the rare nights they said it at all, in low voices that went still whenever he walked near. Before, he had been the kind of leader who laughed without deciding to, who knocked his own brother flat in greeting more times than either of them could count, who filled a room and never once thought to apologize for it. After, he moved through his own hall like a guard on a wall, effective, trusted, flawless at every task set in front of him, and empty behind the eyes in a way no one had ever found the word for. He thought sometimes about his brother, Nathan, who had come home from the same hard season and simply stopped speaking, a little at first, then more, until the quiet had grown over him like frost creeping across glass, and one morning there was almost nothing left of the boy who used to talk far too much. Silas had given his brother duties, responsibilities, a useful shape to pour himself into so the emptiness would have somewhere to go. It helped, he had told himself. He had never once asked Nathan if it was true. That was the thing he thought about, standing at the cold window while the snow came down without end. All the questions he had never asked. All the people he had quietly shaped into tools, because a tool was so much easier to look at than a wound. He had done it to his brother. He had done it to the wolf. He had done it in the deepest and most honest hours, most of all to himself. And now the border was empty, and the wolf was gone, and Silas Cain could not go looking for himself. That was the cruelty of it. The pack needed their lord standing at the center of the hall, calm and whole, while a storm tried to tear the roof from over their heads. They could not know that the thing they had lost and the man they were looking to were one and the same. They could not know that every hour the Lord stood tall and certain in that hall was an hour their strongest protector lay somewhere under the snow with iron in his leg. So the search went out without him. Riders on foot, wading into a white that swallowed sound and shape alike, calling a name into a wind that ate it, coming back with frost in their brows and nothing in their hands. 2 days of it. They found nothing. The storm was too heavy, the tracks too deep and too gone. And in the great hall, the empty seat stayed empty, and the pack that had always leaned on one unbreakable thing began, very quietly, to feel the ground shift under its feet. Because a pack that loses its steadiest wolf learns something it would rather not know. That nothing was ever as certain as they let themselves believe. Back in the cave, the fire was catching. Cora fed it with hands that barely worked, cracking the old dry wood across her knee, coaxing the small flame the way you coax a frightened thing that might still bolt. The wolf watched her from the back wall, his hurt legs stretched out in front of him, those pale gold eyes tracking every clumsy motion without a single flicker of judgment. "I know," she murmured, not looking up. "I'm doing my best." When the fire finally took, when a low warmth began to push back against the black cold of the stone, she sat back on her heels and looked at him, really looked, for the first time. The leg was not broken. She could see that much. The trap had torn into the muscle, cut deep and ugly, but the bone underneath had held. It needed cleaning, wrapping, time. She had nothing to clean it with but snow, which she melted between her raw palms and used anyway. And nothing to wrap it with but a strip torn from the lining of her cloak, which she gave up without much thought at all. The cloak was already ruined. The wolf was not. He let her do it. That surprised her more than anything else that whole long night. He lay still and let a stranger's bleeding fingers move over the worst of his hurt, and he made no sound. And when she tied off the bandage and eased back, he looked down at the wrapped leg. Then he looked at her, with an expression she could not read. "You're welcome," she said softly. Outside, the storm went on, and for the first time in more years than she wanted to name, Being trapped somewhere with no way out did not feel like the worst thing that could happen to her. The second night, the fever came. She woke to the sound of it. A low, ragged breathing from the dark at the back of the cave. Too fast. Catching wrong on every third breath, like a wheel with a broken spoke. She crawled to him. His fur was damp with a heat that had nothing to do with the fire. His eyes had gone glassy, far away, fixed on nothing. And something in her chest pulled tight and cold, because she knew this. She had seen what a wound could do when the body turned its own strength against itself. She had watched it take her father, one slow day at a time, and she had been too small then to do anything but hold his hand. "No," she said, quiet and fierce. "No, you don't get to do this. Not after all of that." She pressed melted snow to him. She talked to him, low and steady, about nothing, because the silence felt like giving up and she was not ready to give up. She did the only small thing she knew how to do, and she stayed close, because leaving was the one thing she could not make herself do. And somewhere in the deepest hour of that night, the air in the cave seemed to bend. The shape at the back wall shivered, shuddered. The white fur seemed to draw inward on itself, to fold and shift and become something else. And Cora scrambled back against the cold stone with her heart slamming hard against her ribs. Because the wolf was gone. And where the wolf had lain, half in shadow and half in the low orange light of the fire, was a man. He was tall. She could see it even folded on the ground like that. Dark hair pushed damp against his forehead. A hard, worn face gone slack and helpless with fever. And his left arm, in the exact place where the trap had closed on the wolf's foreleg, was wrapped in a strip of soft gray cloth. Her cloak lining, the same wound, the same wrapping, the same creature. Cora sat pressed to the wall and could not make a single sound. A shifter. She had heard the old stories, the way everyone raised in these mountains had. Wolves who were more than wolves, men who wore a second shape like a second coat. But a story told by a winter fire and a living man shuddering into being 3 feet away are not the same thing at all. He stirred. His eyes opened. Dark now. Not gold. But with something of that same gold burning far down underneath. They searched the dim light, found her, and held there. For a long moment, neither of them moved. "You," he said. His voice came rough, cracked at the edges, from the fever, from disuse, from something older and heavier than either. "You're the one who opened the trap." It was not a question. Cora's mouth had gone dry. "You're a man." Something ghosted across his face. Not quite a smile. Too tired for that. "Sometimes," he said. Then the fever rolled back over him, and his eyes felt closed, and his whole weight tipped toward the ground. And she caught him. She did not decide to. Her body moved before her mind could argue, and then his weight was against her, heavy and burning, his head coming to rest against her shoulder. And she was holding a strange man she had every reason in the world to fear. She could have let him fall. She held on instead. Scent came first. That was the thing that would stay with her long after, when she tried to lay the night out in order and make sense of it. Before anything else, there was the way he smelled. Wood smoke and cold stone, and something underneath it. Pine, maybe. And something warmer than pine. Something she had no business calling safe. that her body called safe anyway. She had spent her whole life keeping a careful distance from every living soul, learning the exact space a wolfless girl was allowed to take up in a room, learning to fold herself small, to make herself easy to step around, easy to overlook, easy to forget. And now there was a fevered stranger burning in her arms, and every instinct that had kept her small and separate all those years had gone strangely, completely quiet. He shivered against her. She pulled the ruined cloak over the both of them. There was not enough warmth to spare, and she knew it the way she knew the storm signs. If the fever ran wild, and the fire burned low, and the cold got its fingers into him, he would not last until morning. And the only heat left in this cave that was worth anything at all was her own. So she stayed close, closer than she had let herself be to another living being in more years than she wanted to count. She pressed her side to his and felt him shudder, and then, slow, begin to still. His breathing eased, the wrong catch in it smoothed away, and somewhere in that long dark, his hand found the front of her cloak and closed around a fistful of it, the way a drowning man closes his hand around a thrown rope. He did not let go. Cora lay very still. She was afraid that if she moved even an inch, he would wake and remember to be guarded and pull away. He did not pull away. He surfaced once more before the dawn, not all the way. Just enough for his eyes to crack open, dark and unfocused. Just enough to feel the warmth of her pressed along his side, and the weight of a cloak that smelled of wood smoke and blood, and something that quieted the wild thing pacing in his chest. Some part of him, the part that had spent years braced against the world, waited for it to be a trick. It always was, somewhere. That was what the long seasons had taught him. Kindness had a cost. Nearness had a price. Everyone, in the end, wanted the wolf for what the wolf could do for them. He waited for this stranger to want something too. She did not. She only breathed beside him, slow and even, and gave him the last of her warmth, and asked for nothing at all in return. He could not remember the last time that had happened. He could not remember the last time he had let it. "Don't," warned some old and careful voice down in the dark of him. "Don't let this in. You know how it ends. You leave or they leave. And either way, you wake up alone with the cold again." But the fever was stronger than the warning, and her warmth was realer than the fear. And for the first time in longer than he had any name for, Silas Kane stopped bracing. He let himself be held by a stranger with bleeding hands. And in the low orange light, with the storm still screaming somewhere far above the stone, the wolf who had forgotten how to rest finally slept. Far away, in a settlement gone silent, a lord's seat stood cold and empty in the dark, and a whole pack lay sleepless through the storm, waiting for a wolf they were certain would come back to them exactly as he left. Not one of them guessed the truth, that he would come back changed, and that the one who changed him was a woman their own kind had already thrown away. Morning came gray and slow. The fever had broken some time before the first light. Cora felt it go the way you feel a tide turn far out at sea, a loosening in the body pressed against her side, the wild heat draining down out of him into something cooler, something that was only sleep now. She did not move for a long time, partly because she was afraid to wake him, and partly because she could not remember the last time she had stayed still in one place and felt no need at all to brace for whatever came next. The man beside her breathed slow and even. Outside, the storm went on. When he woke, he was a wolf again. She had half expected it, and still it caught her off guard. One moment there was a man asleep against the cold stone. The next, the air folded and shifted the way it had in the night, and the great white wolf lay where the man had been, watching her with those pale gold eyes. Awake now, clear, the fever gone out of them. They looked at each other across the low fire for a long moment. "So," Cora said, "that's how it is with you." He said nothing. He was a wolf. But something in the set of his ears, in the tilt of his heavy head, told her he had heard every word. "You don't have to explain yourself," she went on. "I've heard the old stories. Wolves that are more than wolves." She drew her knees up under the ruined cloak. "I just never once thought I'd have one of them bleeding all over me in the middle of a snowstorm." The wolf huffed a breath out through his nose. It was almost a laugh, and something in her chest eased, just a little, at the sound of it. The first full day in the cave passed slow. She hunted because they had to eat, and there was no one else to do it. She had not hunted since she was a girl. Since her father took her out into the cold a handful of times before the fever took him, and she had not been good at it even then. She was worse now. Her hands made it worse still. The cuts from the trap had stiffened overnight, gone tight and sore, and gripping the crude snare she had twisted out of a strip of cloak lining meant leaning her weight onto the 3 fingers that hurt the most. She did it anyway. It took most of the morning to catch a single thin rabbit, and she caught it by luck, far more than skill, but she carried it back to the cave. She cooked it over the fire, and she set half of it down on the stone in front of the wolf. He would not eat while she watched. She learned that quickly, so she turned her back and busied her raw hands with the fire, and after a moment, she heard him eat. She ate her own half slow. It was not enough. She noted that the way she noted most hard things in her life, without any drama, and moved on. That night, she began to talk to him. She did not decide to. It simply happened, the way things happen when you have been alone long enough that the thin line between thinking a thing and saying it out loud starts to wear away to nothing. "My father was a carpenter," she said into the dark. The wolf's ears turned toward her. "Not a good one, and he knew it too. That was the thing I loved most about him. He never once pretended to be better than he was." She watched the flames. He had a saying. Whenever he built something and it came out wrong, which was often, he'd stand back and look at it and say, "A crooked table can still hold a meal." A small smile touched her mouth and faded. Our whole home was full of crooked things that somehow still did the job. Chairs that leaned to one side, a cupboard door that never quite shut right, and him in the middle of all of it, humming to himself, not the least bit sorry. The wolf watched her without moving. He died when I was 9. Fever. It took him 4 days. Her voice did not shake. She had carried the words long enough that they had worn smooth, the way a stone worn smooth in a pocket. And after he was gone, there wasn't really anyone, not for me. She fed a stick to the fire and watched it catch. She told him more than she meant to, about the storeroom she had slept in as a child until the old woman who owned it passed on as well. And Cora learned young that the ones who let her stay had a habit of not staying themselves. About the small house on the far edge of the settlement that no one else wanted, because the roof let the rain in, and the wind found every crack in the walls, and the cold lived in it like a second tenant. About the market days, about the careful, silent dance she had learned to read before she was even grown, the way people moved around her without seeming to move at all, the small shifts of a shoulder, a foot, a turned back, the invisible circle that opened wherever she walked and closed again the very moment she had passed. She had learned to take up as little space in the world as a person could. She had learned to make herself easy to overlook. For a long time, she said slowly, I thought that if I could just be small enough, quiet enough, useful enough, that one day they would forget the word they'd hung on me and start to see the person underneath it. She shook her head, slow. They never did. You can't earn your way out of a name that people decided about you before you ever drew your first breath. The wolf had gone completely still. I'm not telling you all this so you'll pity me, she added, quieter. I ran out of pity for myself a long, long time ago. It's only... I've never once said any of it out loud before. There was never anyone to say it to. He listened. That was the thing she kept circling back to in the warm quiet afterward. He did not look away. He did not shift his weight or glance toward the cave mouth or do any of the 1,000 small restless things people did when they were only waiting for her to be finished so they could leave. He simply listened, as though the words had weight. As though she had weight, and on the far side of the fire, the wolf, who was also a man, was thinking a thing he could not say. That he had led a pack of hundreds, that he had stood at the head of a great hall while voices rose and fell all around him, and that he had never once, in all those years, heard anyone speak the way this woman spoke, plainly. Asking for nothing, setting the hardest truths of a whole hard life down on the ground between them like smooth stones, not for sympathy, just to finally set them down somewhere. He knew about carrying things you never let yourself set down. He had built an entire life out of exactly that. Sometime deep in the second night, she sang, an old song her father used to hum under his breath while he worked. She did not know all the words, so she filled the gaps with sounds that felt right, the way she had as a small girl, the way you do with the songs you learn long before you understand what they mean. Her voice was not good. She knew her voice was not good. She sang anyway. The wolf lifted his head from his paws. He watched her through the whole of it, and when the last note faded down into the soft crackle of the fire, the cave was very quiet. I don't actually have a good voice, she said, half laughing at herself. The wolf lowered his head, slow, deliberate. She decided to take it as a polite disagreement. He moved closer that night, not right beside her, just closer than the far wall, a little nearer the fire, a little nearer to her. She noticed and she said nothing, because to name it out loud might undo it. And on the second afternoon, she said a thing she had not planned to say at all. You're the first living thing that stayed near me for more than a day. Her voice was low, almost to herself. I don't mean it to sound sad, I'm just noting it, the way I note most things. The wolf rose to his feet. He crossed the small space between them, slow, still favoring the hurt leg, and he lowered his great white head down onto her shoulder. He was so heavy, she nearly tipped sideways. She caught herself, and then she went very still, because she was suddenly, painfully afraid that if she moved even a little, he would lift his head away again, and she was not ready for that. Not yet. He did not lift it away. She raised one careful hand and rested it against the thick, warm fur of his neck, and the two of them sat like that in the firelight, while the storm screamed itself hoarse somewhere far above the stone. Two creatures the world had already decided it was finished with, keeping each other warm. By the third day, the shape of something had grown up between them that neither of them had a word for. It was not tameness. He was not tame. She had watched him tear into that rabbit when he thought she wasn't looking, and there was nothing tame in it. It was something closer to trust, the kind of trust that does not announce itself, that builds quietly, in the small things, in the way he no longer tensed when she reached for his hurt leg to check the wrapping, in the way she no longer flinched at the size of him, in the way they had begun, without either of them choosing it, to breathe in the same slow rhythm when they sat together by the fire. She caught herself thinking once that she would be almost sorry when the storm ended, and then she caught the thought and folded it up small and put it away, because storms ended. That was the one thing storms always did, and the things that sheltered together through them went their separate ways after, back out into a world that had its own ideas about where each of them belonged. She knew better than to forget that. She had learned, very young, not to hold too tightly to things that were only ever passing through. Then the storm cracked open. Not gently. It was the scent that reached him first. The wolf came awake all at once, the way he had not come awake in years, every sense in him snapping alert at the same instant. Cora startled beside him, still half caught in sleep. "What?" she breathed. "What is it?" He was already on his feet, low in his broad chest, a sound she had not heard from him before. Not the snarl he had given her that first night in the trap. Something deeper than that, older, a warning meant for the world outside the cave, and not for her at all. Then she heard it too, under the moan of the wind. Voices, men's voices, and beneath them, long and low and hungry, the belling of hounds on a scent. Hunters, the kind who set the iron traps and sometimes remembered to come back for them, the kind who had likely found that trap sprung and empty in the snow and followed the blood, his and hers both, all the long way to the mouth of this cave. Cora's stomach turned to ice. "They'll want the pelt," she whispered, some cold, practical corner of her mind already doing the terrible math. A white wolf that size. They will absolutely want the pelt. The wolf turned his head and looked at her, and in that look, she understood exactly what he meant to do. "No," she said. "No. Your leg. You can barely put weight on it. You can't." But he was already moving toward the vines at the cave mouth, low, silent, the hurt leg tucked up under him, his whole weight balanced onto the other three. And she saw, in the terrible smoothness of the way he moved, that this was a thing he knew how to do. That was the worst part. He was good at it. He had been made good at it, somewhere, by someone, in a life she knew nothing about. He slipped out into the white before she could stop him. Cora dropped low at the mouth of the cave, her heart slamming, and watched the pale shape of him dissolve into the blowing snow. She heard the hounds change their note from the steady drone of a trail to the wild, climbing pitch of a pack that has suddenly found something far larger and far more dangerous than it ever bargained for. She heard men shout. She heard the deep, rolling snarl of the white wolf, thrown from rock to rock until it seemed to come from everywhere at once, until it seemed there was not one wolf out there in the storm, but 10. And she understood then what he was doing. He was not fighting them. He was leading them, drawing the hounds and the men away from the cave, away from her, out into the heart of the storm, where his white coat made him a ghost, and their torches only made them blind. He was giving the hunters a wolf to chase, so that they would never find the woman he had hidden. The sounds moved off, slowly, terribly, down the ridge and away, the hounds' voices thinning into the wind until Cora could no longer tell them from the storm itself. And then there was nothing. Only the snow, only the low fire behind her, only her own breath, coming too fast, fogging white in the freezing air. She waited. She did not know for how long. Long enough that the fire burned down low and she did not feed it, because feeding it meant taking her eyes off the cave mouth, and she found she could not do that. Long enough that the cold, practical voice in the back of her mind began, very quietly, to tell her that he was not coming back, that he had led them off and gone down under their spears somewhere out in the endless white, and that she would never even know where or how. She told that voice to be quiet. It would not be quiet. And then the vines moved, and he was there, the white wolf, limping harder now. One flank streaked red where something had caught him. Snow packed thick into his fur, his breath heaving in great clouds, but alive, on his feet. Come back. Cora was across the cave before she knew she had moved. She dropped to her knees in front of him and ran her hands over him, fast and searching, hunting for the wound. It was there along his side, a long, shallow line where a blade had grazed him. Ugly, but not deep. Not deep enough to take him. You reckless thing, she said, and her voice cracked clean in half on it. You could have died. Out there. For me. For a wolfless nobody that they threw out into the snow to freeze. You could have died. And for what? She stopped, because the wolf had turned his head and pressed his broad brow hard against her chest, and stood there, breathing rough, leaning the whole of his weight into her. The way you lean into the one thing in all the world you trust to hold you up. And Cora wrapped both arms around his neck and held on. Held a creature that had just walked out into a storm and a hunt and come back through it. For her. No one had ever done anything for her. Not one single thing. Not in her whole small, careful, overlooked life. She had spent that life as the one who gave way, the one who stepped aside, the one who was kept like a broken chair in a shed, because throwing her out felt wrong, and bringing her in felt wrong too. And this half-wild, half-broken thing had gone out and bled for her, and dragged himself back, and now stood shaking in her arms, because standing was very nearly more than he had left to give. "I've got you," she whispered fierce into his fur. "You hear me? Whatever you are. I've got you now." Far above the two of them, the storm began, at last, to weaken. The wind lost its cruel edge. The snow began to thin. Somewhere behind the heavy clouds, a paler gray came seeping through, the first hint that the sky still remembered how to hold the light. Cora did not notice. She was too busy pressing melted snow to a wolf's wounded side, scolding him low and unsteady under her breath, winding the very last usable strip of her ruined cloak around him, tying it off with fingers that had finally stopped bleeding. She did not notice that the storm was dying. She would not let herself think about what the end of the storm might mean. That, when the snow finally stopped falling, a wolf who belonged somewhere would remember exactly where that was, and that a woman who had never belonged anywhere would be left, once again, to stand and watch someone she had come to need walk away from her into the white. But that was tomorrow's grief. Tonight, he was here. Tonight, he was warm and breathing and leaning his great trusting weight into her hands. And Cora had learned, over a long and lonely life, to hold on to tonight for as long as the world would let her. Because tonight had always been the only thing the world ever let her keep. The wound along his side closed slowly through the night. Cora tended it the way she had tended everything in that cave. Carefully, quietly, with hands that had learned long ago how to be gentle with the things nobody else would touch. He was a man again by the time the worst of it eased. She had stopped being startled by the change. Somewhere in these long days, the shifting between shapes had become just another thing about him. The way a person has a certain laugh, or a certain way of standing in a doorway. He lay near the fire, the strip of gray cloth wound around his ribs, watching her feed the flames. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Lead them off. You could have stayed hidden. They might never have found the cave. They would have found it." His voice had lost the fever roughness. It was low and even, and there was something underneath it that she was only beginning to learn to hear. "And they would have found you. I'm not worth a wolf getting killed over." He turned his head and looked at her. A long look. The kind that goes past the surface of a person and rests somewhere underneath. "You keep saying that," he said, "that you're not worth things." Cora shrugged and fed another stick to the fire. "I keep saying it because it's true." "No." His voice was very quiet. "You keep saying it because someone told you it was true a long time ago, and you were too young to know the difference between a thing that's true and a thing that's just said loudly enough." She went still. The fire popped. Outside, the wind had softened to almost nothing. She did not have an answer for that. In her whole life, no one had ever said such a thing to her. No one had ever bothered to look close enough to notice there was a difference to be named. They did not sleep much that third night. Neither of them said why. There was a knowing in the cave now, a kind of weight in the air between them, warm and close and terrifying, and both of them stepped carefully around the edges of it, the way you step around the mouth of a well in the dark. She told him the rest of her small history, the things she had held back before, the years she had stopped hoping for anyone to stay, the quiet she had made a home inside, because quiet was the one thing that never left. And he told her a little of his. Not much, not everything, but more than she sensed he had told anyone in a very long time. He told her about a hard season that had taken people from him. Brothers. He did not use the word war exactly, but she understood the shape of it, the way you understand the shape of a stone under snow. He told her about coming back from it and finding that some part of him had stayed behind out there in the cold. After, he said, I was still useful, still strong, still every single thing they needed me to be. He was staring into the fire. I just wasn't anything, not underneath. I did what was asked, and I did it well, and no one ever noticed that the thing doing it had gone somewhere else and not come back. Cora watched his profile in the firelight. They saw a weapon, she said softly. Not a person. He was quiet a moment. Yes, he said. That's it exactly. A weapon. I know that feeling from the other side, she said. They saw a curse, not a person. She almost smiled. Funny. 2 different words. Same emptiness underneath. He turned and looked at her again, and this time neither of them looked away. At some point in that long, warm, sleepless dark, his hand found hers. Just that. Just his hand closing over hers, slow, giving her every chance in the world to pull away. She did not pull away. His fingers were rough, calloused, warm now, all the fever gone out of them, and where they wrapped around her scarred and battered ones, she felt something she had no name for move through her whole chest. She had spent a lifetime keeping a careful distance from every living soul. And here, in the dark, in a cave at the end of the world, she let a stranger hold her hand, and she held his back, and the space she had kept empty around herself for so many years quietly, finally closed. Cora, he said, just her name, learning the shape of it in his mouth. You never told me yours, she said. A pause. No, he said. I didn't. And she understood, without quite understanding, that this was not carelessness, that there was a reason he had let her pour out her whole life and had given back only pieces of his own, that somewhere in this man was a locked room she had not been let into. She did not push. She had spent enough of her life on the outside of locked rooms to know you do not force them. You wait. They did not cross the last line that night. It would have been easy. The wanting was there, thick in the small, warm space, in the way his thumb moved slow over the back of her hand, in the way her breath caught when he leaned close enough that she could smell the pine and wood smoke and warmth of him. But he stopped. He drew back, just slightly, and pressed his forehead to hers, and stayed there, breathing her in, holding the moment right at its trembling edge and not letting it tip over. Not like this, he murmured. Not with everything I haven't told you still sitting between us. She should have been hurt by that. Some old, wounded part of her braced for it. The familiar sting of not being wanted, not being enough. It did not come, because there was nothing in his voice that said, not you. There was only something that said, not yet. Something that said, you deserve more than half of me, and half of me is all I have to give tonight. No one had ever thought she deserved more. She closed her eyes and let her forehead rest against his, and for one perfect suspended moment, 2 people the world had thrown away held each other at the very edge of something, and chose, together, to wait for it to be real. It was the closest thing to happiness she had ever felt. She should have known better than to trust it. She woke to gray light, the wrong kind of gray, pale and even and still. It took her a moment, lying there in the cooling ashes of the fire, to understand what was different. The wind was gone. The storm had stopped. She lay very still and listened to the silence, and something in her chest went cold and tight before her mind had even finished waking, because some part of her had known this was coming, had known it since the first day, had folded the knowing up small and hidden it away, and now it came unfolding, slow and merciless. Storms end, and when they do, the things that sheltered together go their separate ways. She turned her head. He was at the mouth of the cave, a man still in the gray dawn, standing among the dead vines with his back to her, looking out at the world the storm had left behind. Still, broad, achingly familiar already after only 3 days, in the way that only the people who reach something deep in us ever become. He was dressed. He was ready. And she understood, looking at the line of his shoulders, exactly what was about to happen. "You have somewhere to be," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He went still. He did not turn around. "Yes," he said at last. "It's all right." And she made herself say the next words, because they were the ones she had spent her whole life learning to say. "You don't owe me anything." That made him turn, and the look on his face, when he did, was not the face of a man walking away lightly. It was drawn, tight, fighting something she could not see the shape of. "That's not true," he said quietly. "I owe you a great deal, more than I can pay standing here in this cave." "Then stay," she said. The word slipped out before she could stop it, small and bare, and she hated how much of her was inside it. Something crossed his face like a wound. "I can't," he said. He crossed the cave to her. He knelt down in front of where she sat, and he took both her scarred hands in his, and he looked at her the way she had wanted, her whole life, for someone to look at her, like she was the only thing in the room, like she was worth the looking. "There are things I have to answer for," he said. "People counting on me. A thing I've been holding together that will come apart if I'm not there to hold it. I didn't choose this storm, and I didn't choose to be caught in that trap. But I chose to come to you when I could have run, and I don't regret it. I will never regret it." "Then why does it feel like goodbye?" she whispered. He didn't answer that. He couldn't, and she saw that he couldn't. And somehow that was worse than any answer, because there was more here. There was the locked room. There was the name he had never told her. There was some whole shape of a life he carried that she had not been let into. And it was pulling him back out into the white, away from her. And there was nothing she could do to hold it. "Cora." He said her name like it cost him something. "Whatever you believe about yourself, whatever they taught you, it's a lie. Do you hear me? The word they hung on you is a lie." She nodded because it was easier than speaking. She did not believe him. Not yet. But she nodded. He pressed his lips to her forehead. One kiss, long, steady. A promise or an apology, she could not tell which, and maybe it was both. Then he stood, and he walked to the mouth of the cave, and between one step and the next, the air folded and shifted, and the man was gone, and the great white wolf stood among the vines in his place. He looked back at her once, those pale gold eyes holding hers across the small dim space that had held the whole of the last 3 days. Everything they had not said sitting in that look, heavy and unfinished. And then he stepped through the vines and into the snow and was gone. No ceremony, No backward glance after that first one. Just gone. The way people had always gone from her life. The way she had known, deep down, that he would go too. Cora sat in the cave for a long time after. She was not sure what she was waiting for. Some part of her, small and foolish and never quite killed no matter how many times the world had tried, waited for the vines to move again, for him to come back, for this once, this one single time in her whole life, for the person who left to turn around and come back. He did not come back. She had not really expected him to. And here is the thing she did then that no one who had watched her whole small life would have expected. She did not fall apart. She sat with the grief. She let it move through her, sharp and total, the way she had learned to let hard things move through her rather than fighting them. And when it had passed through, when it had wrung out everything it was going to wring out of her, she wiped her face with the back of one scarred hand, and she got up. She put out the fire, banking the ashes the way her father had taught her, so a spark would not catch the dry wood after she was gone. She stacked the last of the wood neatly against the wall for whoever came next. She had not thought about whoever came next 3 days ago. She thought about it now. She wrapped the ruined cloak tight around her shoulders, and she stood in the mouth of the cave where he had stood, and she looked out at the white world the storm had left behind, clean, silent, endless. Somewhere east was another settlement, half a day, in good weather, and the weather, for the first time in 3 days, was good. She did not know, standing there, what waited for her in the east. She did not know that a chain and a false charge and a great stone hall waited for her. She did not know that the man who had walked out of this cave without telling her his name was not just any wolf, but the one the whole territory answered to. That the locked room she had not been let into was a throne. She did not know that she would see those pale gold eyes again, and soon, and in the last place on earth she would ever have looked for them. She knew only this, that for 3 days, in a cave at the end of the world, someone had stayed near her, had listened to her, had bled for her, and held her hand in the dark, and told her the word they hung on her was a lie. And even though he had left, even though he had walked away into the white like everyone always did, something in her had shifted and would not shift back, not healed, not fixed, just slightly less certain that nothing good was ever coming. She stepped out into the snow. The cold took her at once, sharp and familiar, an old companion. She turned east, and she began to walk toward whatever came next, the way she had walked toward everything her whole life. Alone, on her own 2 feet, carrying the little she had. But there was something new in her now, small and stubborn as a spark banked under ashes. A voice, quiet still, barely there, but hers. And it was saying, for the first time in her whole overlooked life, that maybe, just maybe, she was worth more than the word they had thrown her out with. She did not know yet how soon she would have to prove it. She only kept walking, east, into the light. The eastern settlement came into view on the afternoon of the 4th day. For about 2 hours, it felt like maybe things were going to be all right. Cora walked in through streets she half remembered from a childhood visit, holding a hand that was long gone now. She found a row of stalls. She found people who did not know her name, and did not know the word that came with it, and looked at her like she was simply a traveler come in off a hard road. No one stepped around her. No invisible circle opened and closed as she passed. She had not understood, until she felt its absence, how heavy that circle had been, how much of her whole life she had spent inside it. For 2 hours, she was just a woman looking at bolts of cloth outside a dry goods shop, and then the merchant came out. "That cloak," he said. Cora looked up. The clasp. On the left side there. His eyes had narrowed. His voice had changed. "That's mine. Stolen off my stall. Some weeks back." She looked down at the clasp. She had never once looked at it closely. Old bronze, tarnished dark, shaped like a small running wolf. It had come with the cloak when the elders pressed the ruined thing into her hands on the day they cast her out. Given to me, she thought, by the same people who threw me into a storm to die. Which is going to sound like exactly the kind of thing a person says when they have in fact stolen something. "I didn't take it," she said. "They all say that. It came with a cloak. I was given the cloak." By who? And there it was, because the truth, the real and complete truth, was a thing she could not prove, standing in a market street with frost still in her hair. The people who could confirm her story were half a day west, behind a closed gate, and they were the very people who wanted her gone. The merchant was already signaling to someone. "You can explain it," he said, to the hall. She had never seen the great hall of the Packlord before. She had not imagined it would be so large. She had certainly not imagined she would be seeing it for the first time with her wrists bound in front of her, and a guard's hand heavy on her shoulder, steering her across a floor of cold gray stone. The ceiling rose so high the torchlight could not reach it. The walls were thick, the windows small, so that even in the middle of the day the light had to fight its way in, and mostly lost. There were people in the hall, many of them, standing along the walls, kneeling in loose rows, all of them turning to look at the bound woman being brought before their lord. And at the far end, on a raised stone dais, was the seat of the pack lord, empty. While Cora walked her long, slow walk toward an empty throne, that throne's owner stood in a room above the hall and wrestled with the hardest choice of his life. He had come home the day before. He had walked in through his own gates at mid-morning, on 4 legs, with pine needles caught in his shoulder and a strip of soft gray cloth wrapped neat around one foreleg. And his people had come running, and his brother Nathan had stood silent at the edge of the courtyard, and every one of them had looked at him with the same startled question in their eyes, because something was different. They could not name it, but they felt it. The Lord who had come home did not move like a sentry on a wall anymore. There was something loosened in him, something almost at rest. One of the old guards, a man who had known him since before the hard season, had watched him cross the courtyard and had said, quietly, to no one at all, "He looks like a man who slept." And it was true. For the first time in longer than any of them could remember, Silas Kane looked like a creature that had, however briefly, set something down. He had not told a soul where he had been. How could he? How do you stand in a great stone hall in front of the pack that counts on you to be unbreakable and tell them that their lord spent 3 days in a cave being tended by a woman with bleeding hands? that he had let her wrap his wound and feed him and hold him through a fever, that he had let her talk and had listened and had felt, for the first time in years, like something more than a weapon on a wall, that he had held her hand in the dark, that he had wanted, more than he had wanted anything in a very long time, to stay. He could not tell them that. And there was a worse thing he could not tell them, and it sat in his chest now like a stone. He knew who she was, or rather, he knew what she was. He had heard her tell it herself by the firelight in that plain, unflinching voice. Wolfless, cursed, thrown out of a western pack into a killing storm, for a crime she almost certainly had not committed. And he knew what it would cost, in the eyes of his own people, for the lord of the pack to claim a woman like that. That was the dilemma that held him upstairs while the guards brought her in. Not whether he cared for her. That question had answered itself somewhere in the second night of the storm, and there was no unanswering it now. The question was whether he had the right to let it show, because a pack lord did not belong only to himself. He belonged to all of them, to the hundreds who looked to him for order, for strength, for the certainty that the ground beneath them would hold. And a lord who came home from a storm and set a wolfless outcast beside his own seat would shake that certainty, would give the doubters something to whisper about, would hand every rival and every restless heart in the territory a crack to work at. He had spent years holding this pack together, one piece at a time, with his bare hands. Did he have the right to risk all of that? For one woman? For his own heart? There was a knife on the desk in front of him. Not a weapon. A small folding knife, horn-handled, the kind a boy carries in his pocket. It had been pressed into his palm long ago by a man who did not use many words, on a hard morning he did not like to remember. He had used it ever since to open letters. He was aware that this was not what it was for. He was aware he had never once put it away. He picked it up now and turned it over in his fingers, the way he did when he needed his hands busy so his mind could work. The horn was smooth in the places his thumb always went. He had worn it smooth himself over the years, turning it over and over on nights like this one. Below him, in the hall, a chain shifted against cold stone. He did not hear it, but it was there. A woman waiting to be judged, 3 floors down, while a man 3 floors up turned an old knife over and over and decided whether to let her keep being no one. And he thought about his brother, Nathan, who had come home from the same hard season and gone quiet, and whom Silas had handed duties, responsibilities, a useful shape to pour himself into. Because a busy tool was easier to look at than a grieving man. It helped, he had told himself. He had never asked. And now, standing at the window with an old knife in his hand and a bound woman being marched into his hall below, Silas thought about all the years he had chosen the pack's comfort over the truth of a person. All the times he had picked the smooth, useful silence over the hard, honest word. He had done it to his brother. He had almost, in the safety of this room, been about to do it again, to let her stand in his hall as a stranger, to hear her charge and rule on it fairly, and send her on her way with coin and an apology. And never once let a single soul in that hall know that this was the woman who had reached into a frozen trap with her bare, bleeding hands and pulled him out of it. It would be the safe thing. It would be the Lord's thing, and it would be exactly the same choice he had made about his brother, and about the wolf, and about himself. The choice to keep the useful silence, to let a person go unseen because seeing them cost something. The door opened. Nathan stood in it. He did not speak. He rarely did anymore. But he looked at his brother, and then he looked at the knife turning over in his brother's hands, and something moved in his silent face. "She's here," Nathan said. 2 words. It was more than he had offered in days. Silas went very still. "Who's here?" he said, though he already knew. "The woman they arrested. In the market." Nathan's voice was rough with disuse, quiet as snowfall. "The one with the wolf clasp." A pause. "The one whose cloak is missing its lining." Silas looked at his brother, and Nathan, who had not truly looked at anyone in longer than either of them could count, looked back. And in his tired eyes was something Silas had not seen there in years. Something awake. "You came back different," Nathan said slowly. "Everyone sees it. They don't know why. I do." He nodded once toward the hall below. "It's her, isn't it?" Silas did not answer. He did not have to. "I spent the whole hard season watching you carry us," Nathan said. The words came slow and hard, dragged up from somewhere deep and long unused. "And I spent every season after watching you disappear inside the carrying. You gave me a job so you wouldn't have to see me grieve. I let you. It was easier." He stepped into the room, "But I saw you come through that gate yesterday. And for one moment, before you remembered to be the Lord again, you looked like my brother, the one from before, the one who laughed." His voice caught. "I haven't seen him in years, Silas. I thought he was gone. And then a stranger in a cave gives him back to me in 3 days. And you're standing up here deciding whether to pretend she doesn't exist." Silence. The old knife lay still in Silas's hand. "You know what they'll say," Silas said at last, very low. "If I claim her, a wolfless woman, cast out. You know what it does to a pack when the doubters get a crack to work at." "I know. I've spent years holding this together." "I know that too." Nathan's tired eyes did not leave his face. "But you spent those same years teaching all of us that strength was silence, that a person is worth what they can do, and nothing underneath. You believed it about the wolf. You believed it about me." A pause. "You believed it about yourself." He nodded again toward the hall. "She doesn't believe it. That's what you're afraid of. Not what the pack will say." Nathan's voice dropped, almost gentle. "You're afraid that if you claim her, you have to admit she's right. That all of us, all this time, were worth more than what we could do for you." And there it was, laid bare in his brother's quiet, ruined voice. The real choice. Not the pack's comfort against Cora's cost. Not strength against weakness. But the old, safe, familiar lie against a small, stubborn truth that a wolfless woman had spoken by a firelight, in a voice that asked for nothing. "You keep saying you're not worth things." He had said that to her. He had meant it. And now the test of whether he had meant it was standing in chains in the hall below, waiting to be judged by the very kind of silence he had spent his whole life keeping. Silas Kane looked down at the old knife in his hand, and for the first time in 11 years, he folded it closed and set it down on the desk and left it there. Nathan he said. Yes. When they call her charge in the hall. He drew a slow breath, and something in his shoulders came loose. Some weight he had carried so long he had stopped feeling it as weight. Don't let them finish it. Nathan almost smiled. It sat strange and lovely on his long, unused face. And you? Silas was already moving toward the door. I'm going to do the thing I should have done years ago, he said. For you. For the wolf. For all of it. He paused at the threshold, one hand on the cold frame. I'm going to stop keeping the useful silence. Down in the great hall, Cora stood in her chains on the cold stone floor. She did not know that a choice had just been made in a room above her head. She did not know that a man she thought she would never see again had just set down a knife he had held for 11 years. She knew only that the hall was vast and full and silent, that every eye in it was on her, that she was, once again, a bound and friendless woman standing accused of something she had not done, waiting for powerful people to decide her fate without asking her a single question. It was the oldest, most familiar shape her life had ever taken, and this time, though she did not yet know it, it was about to break. The guard beside her cleared his throat and began to read the charge. This woman was taken in the market, in possession of stolen property. A bronze clasp, marked as taken from a merchant's stall some weeks past. She offers no proof of. Cora stood very still and let the words wash over her. She had heard words like these before. Different hall, different faces, same shape. A voice reading out her guilt in a tone that had already decided, while a room full of strangers watched, certain of a thing they had never once bothered to check. She had learned, long ago, how to stand inside that certainty and not break. You make yourself small. You make yourself still. You wait for it to be over, because arguing only gives them more to be certain about. That was the plan. Stand small. Wait. Survive. It was the plan she had lived her whole life by. And then she heard it. Under the guard's droning voice, under the shift and murmur of the watching crowd, a sound, the particular sound of a very large animal moving across stone. Cora felt the hair rise along her arms before her mind had even caught up. She knew that sound, somewhere deep and wordless in her, in a place that had nothing to do with thought. She knew it. She saw the crowd begin to shift, people stepping back, moving aside, opening a path down the center of the great hall, the way water opens around a stone dropped into it. And through the gap they made came the wolf, white, enormous, moving with that unhurried certainty she would have known anywhere, that patience that was not slowness, that way of taking up space in the world as though he had never once in his life needed to apologize for it. Cora stopped breathing. She knew that wolf. She knew the size of him, the color of his fur, the way the torchlight caught in his pale gold eyes and held there. She knew the way he moved, and she knew the strip of gray cloth still wound around his foreleg, her cloak lining, that no one in this whole hall had been allowed to remove. He walked down the center of the great hall, past the guards, past the kneeling rows of his own people, past the empty throne on its high stone dais, without so much as a glance at it, and he lay down at her feet. The hall went utterly silent, not the shuffling, murmuring quiet of a crowd waiting for a verdict. Something deeper than that, a stunned, breathless hush, as hundreds of people struggled to understand what their eyes were showing them. The white wolf, Their white wolf, the one that had vanished into the storm, the one they had searched 2 days for and given up as lost, lying down at the feet of a bound and accused stranger. Cora looked down at him. He looked up at her, those pale gold eyes steady and calm, and she felt her whole chest crack open, and everything she had held so carefully together for 4 days came apart all at once. "You," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "You didn't look back." He blinked, slow. "You just left." The words came out shaking now, 4 days of them spilling loose. No goodbye that meant anything. No name. You walked out into the snow, and I told myself I'd never see you again, and I made myself all right with it, because I've had a whole life of making myself all right with it. And now here you are. He pressed his great head against her bound hands. "Here you are," she breathed. From the dais, a voice, careful, low, threaded through with something no one in that hall had ever heard in it before. "He's never done that." Cora looked up. A man was coming down the steps of the dais, not from the throne. He had not been sitting on the throne. He had been standing to the side of it, in a plain dark tunic, unremarkable, the kind of man your eye would slide right past in a crowded room, until he moved. And then you saw it, the stillness in him, the particular quiet of someone who had learned to hold himself carefully, because moving carelessly had cost him somewhere, long ago. Dark hair, a hard, tired face that would have been handsome if it weren't so worn, and pale gold eyes, buried down under the dark, burning faintly. The same gold, the exact same gold, as the wolf lying at her feet. Cora's knees nearly went out from under her. "My lord," the guard beside her started, "this woman was found with stolen—" "I heard the charge." The man did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The whole hall bent toward his quiet. "I heard all of it." He came down off the last step, and he stopped a few feet from her, and he looked at the wolf at her feet, and then he looked at her, and something moved across his worn face that she could not name. "But before we speak of clasps," he said, "there is a question I would ask first." He paused. "What did you do to my wolf?" It took her a moment to understand, and then it landed, all of it, all at once. My wolf. The man on the dais. The wolf at her feet. The strip of cloak lining. The pale gold eyes in the man and in the beast. The same eyes. The same creature. The locked room she had never been let into. A throne. He was the lord of the pack. He had been, the whole time, in the cave, in the fever, in the dark, when he held her hand and told her the word they hung on her was a lie. The man she thought she would never see again was the most powerful person in the entire territory. And he had walked out of that cave without telling her. Something old and wounded reared up in her, the familiar sting, the oldest lesson of her life. You were a thing to be used and then set down. He had his warmth from you and his healing, and then he went back to his throne and his power and his people and left you in the snow like everyone always does. She felt the shape of that old story trying to close over her. Stand small, say what they want, survive, and then she looked down at the wolf at her feet, who had walked past his own throne, past his own kneeling people, who had lain down in front of hundreds of them, in front of the whole weight of his own power, and put his head against her bound hands. That was not the act of someone setting her down. That was the loudest thing a creature could say without words. And she understood, standing there in her chains, that she had a choice. She could shrink. She could give them the small, still silence she had given every hall her whole life. Or she could do the thing she had never once been allowed to do. She could speak. She lifted her head, and she looked the lord of the pack in his tired eyes, and she did not make herself small. "I found him in a trap," she said. Her voice came out clear, steadier than she had ever heard it. It carried across the silent hall into every listening corner. In the forest, during the storm, his leg was caught in old iron, and he'd been fighting it for hours, and he was going to die out there in the snow. She lifted her bound hands, and the scars showed plain across 3 fingers. "I took off my glove in a blizzard, and I opened that trap with my bare hands, and he tried to bite me the whole time, and I opened it anyway." The hall did not breathe. I couldn't carry him, so I coaxed him all the way to a cave, an old hunter's shelter, and I built a fire, and I kept it going for 3 days. Her voice did not shake now. She would not let it. I had nothing to clean his wound with but snow, nothing to wrap it with but the lining of my own cloak, that strip of cloth on his leg. That's mine. That's what you're all looking at. She turned, slow, and let her eyes move across the kneeling crowd. All those faces, all that certainty. "I hunted for him," she said, "for 3 days, alone, in a blizzard, with hands that were bleeding from the trap." She looked back at the Lord. There was no one else. There was just me and him and the storm. "You hunted for him," the Lord said quietly. "Yes, alone. There wasn't anyone else." She held his gaze. "There's never been anyone else. Not my whole life." Something moved across his face at that. Something that looked almost like grief. He lowered himself down onto the steps of the dais. Not the throne, just the steps, like a man setting down a weight, like a man who had decided for this one conversation not to be a lord at all. "They called you cursed," he said, "in the pack that cast you out. Wolfless." She lifted her chin. "Cursed was the word they used when they thought I couldn't hear. And you believed it." For a long time. A pause. "Someone told me, not long ago, that it was a lie." Her voice caught, just slightly. "He walked out of a cave before I could decide whether to believe him." The Lord went very still, and on the steps of his own dais, in front of his whole silent pack, Silas Kane bowed his head. "He has been treated as a weapon since the hard season ended," Silas said. He was not speaking only to her now. His voice had lifted just enough to reach the hall. He was speaking to all of them, and it was clear, from the shock rippling through the kneeling rows, that this was not a thing their Lord had ever said aloud. "By this court, by these guards, by me. If I am honest, most of all, by me." He said it without self-pity, just as a fact he was finished carrying. He became very good at being exactly what we needed him to be. And somewhere in that, I stopped noticing that it was different from what he was. He looked at the wolf, at Cora, at the strip of gray cloth. "He came back from a storm 3 days ago, looking like something I hadn't seen in years," Silas said. "Rested, at peace. I couldn't understand it. I stood at my window, and I could not understand what could possibly have given him that, when nothing I had done in years had come close. He looked at her. It was you, he said. You gave him something, without even knowing what it was. I didn't give him anything, Cora said. I found him in a trap, and I stayed. You talked to him, Silas said, like he was someone, not a weapon, not a tool, not a symbol of something a pack needs to feel safe. His voice roughened. You talked to him the way no one in this hall, myself included, has talked to him in years. The wolf rose. He walked, slow, favoring the healing leg, across the small space to the steps of the dais, and he pressed his great head against the shoulder of the man who was also him, in some way none of them could untangle, and Silas lifted a hand and rested it against the side of that white face. Not a command, not control. The way you touch something you very nearly lost. They stayed like that a moment. Then the wolf turned and walked back across the stone and lay down once more at Cora's feet, choosing, in front of all of them, choosing her again, as plainly as a creature could. Silas watched him do it, and then he stood and he looked at the guards, and his voice was the Lord's voice again, but changed, cleaner, unafraid. Take the chains off her. There was a beat of hesitation. My lord, the guard began, the charge, the clasp. The clasp came with a cloak that was forced on her by the people who threw her into a storm to die, Silas said. Send riders west. Send riders to the merchants' records. You will find that clasp went missing long before this woman ever set foot in that market. On a trading road she has never traveled. His eyes did not leave Cora's. I would stake my throne on it. In fact, I believe I just have. The guard moved. The chains came off, and Cora stood in the center of the great hall, rubbing her freed wrists, with a wolf at her feet, and the whole silent weight of a pack's attention on her, and she did not feel small. For the first time in her whole life, standing accused in a hall full of certain strangers, she did not feel small. There is one more thing, Silas said. He came down off the steps and crossed to her, and he stopped close, closer than a lord stops to a stranger, and he lowered his voice so that it was almost only for her. I left you in that cave without my name, he said, and I have regretted it every hour since. I told myself it was to protect you, to protect the pack, that a lord doesn't have the right to want things for himself. A breath. I was wrong. I spent years teaching everyone I loved that they were worth what they could do and nothing more. I nearly did it to you, standing in a room above this hall not an hour ago. I nearly let you stand here as a stranger and never say a word. He shook his head, but a wiser voice than mine reminded me what that silence costs. His eyes flicked, just briefly, to Nathan at the edge of the hall, who stood watching with something bright and awake in his long, tired face. So, no more useful silence. He looked at her, this powerful man, in front of his entire pack, and he did the thing he should have done in the cave. My name is Silas, he said, and you are the woman who reached into a trap with her bare hands and pulled me out of the cold. In every way there is. The truth of the boy came the next morning. Cora had told him the whole of it by then, Late that first night, sitting by the fire in the great hall long after the crowd had gone, she had finally spoken the thing she had never spoken in the cave. The child, Eli, 6 years old, red-haired, always laughing. The accusation. The reason a pack had thrown her into a killing storm in one thin cloak, for a darkness she had no hand in. And Silas, who had spent that whole evening learning exactly what certainty had cost this woman, had gone very still. "A missing child," he said quietly. "And they never found him." "They didn't look," Cora said. "They had me. Why would they keep looking once they had someone to blame?" He sent riders west at first light, and she understood, watching them go, that he had not sent them to clear her name. She was already free. Her name was already her own. He had sent them because somewhere out there, a 6-year-old was still unaccounted for. And no one in that whole certain pack had thought to keep looking. They found him in a storage barn on the edge of the western settlement. Eli, cold and hungry, and completely unharmed. He had wandered off from a gathering and gotten himself shut in behind a heavy door and been too frightened to call out. That was all. That was the whole of the darkness the pack had needed a curse to explain. A scared little boy in a barn, and a woman thrown into a blizzard to pay for it. They brought Cora the word of it in the great hall, and she stood there, freed, with the wolf's warm weight against her leg, and she thought about the western square, the yellow sky. Thorne's certain voice reading out her guilt while the snow rose past her ankles. She thought about all the faces that had looked away, and all the faces that had not, that had watched her walk out into the storm, certain to the very last that she was exactly what they said she was. She was not, it turned out. She never had been. The curse had been a frightened child behind a barn door. And the cursed woman had been the only soul in that whole certain pack who stopped, in a killing storm, to save a life. Silas was watching her face. "You could go back," he said quietly. "West, stand in that square. Let them see exactly what they threw away." There was an edge in it on her behalf that she had never had anyone offer before. "You have every right." Cora was quiet a long moment. Then she looked down at the wolf at her feet, at the man who had set down his silence in front of his whole world, at the brother in the shadows, with something newly alive in his eyes. "No," she said slowly. "I don't need them to see." She lifted her head. "I needed me to see." Her voice was steady and low and entirely her own. "That's the part I never had before. It was never their certainty I couldn't get past. It was that I'd started to believe it too." She drew a breath. "I don't anymore." And the great hall, full of the very kind of silence she had spent her whole life surviving, heard her, every word. They brought Thorne to the great hall 3 days later. He came in the way old men of certain power come into a room, chin up, back straight. The particular stillness of someone who has been making decisions for so long that it has stopped occurring to him, other people are affected by them. Cora watched him from the side of the hall. She was not in chains this time. That was the first thing she noticed, and it surprised her that she noticed it, because a person does not usually notice the absence of a weight until the weight is gone. She stood in a warm hall, in a mended cloak, with a great white wolf at her side, and she watched the man who had thrown her into a storm to die walk in with his chin up as though he still had the right. Silas let him stand there a while, He did not rush it. He had learned somewhere in the last handful of days the difference between silence that protects a person and silence that costs one. This was neither. This was simply letting an old man feel the shape of the room he had walked into. "You sent a woman into the worst storm in a decade," Silas said at last, "in one thin cloak, for a crime that never happened." His voice was level. It did not need to be anything else. Without a single question asked, Thorn opened his mouth. Something practiced, an explanation, smooth from long use. "I didn't ask for an explanation," Silas said. The old man's mouth closed. Silas looked at him for a long moment, and in that look, Cora saw something she had not expected. Not triumph, not cruelty. Something closer to recognition. "I know that face," Silas said quietly. "The face of a man who has made hard decisions for so long that he has forgotten they land on anyone." A pause. "I have seen it, in the mirror, more than once, so I am not going to pretend I am a different kind of man than you are." Thorn said nothing. "But there is one difference," Silas went on. "When it was shown to me, this last week, what my certainty had cost the people around me, I looked at it." His eyes did not leave the old man. "You have spent your whole life not looking. I think that is the worst crime, worse than the storm, worse than the cloak. You never once looked at the person you were so certain about." He did not send Thorn to a cell. Cora had wondered if he would. Some small, hard part of her had almost wanted it. But Silas had thought about this. She could see that he had. "You will not sit in a cell," he said. "A cell is easy. A cell lets a man feel like the injured party. You would sit in the dark and tell yourself a story where you were wronged, and you would come out more certain than you went in." He shook his head, slow. "No, you will go back west, and you will stand in that same square, in front of the same people you govern, the ones who watched you cast her out and said nothing. And you will answer to them, out loud, for what was done." Thorn's face went pale. "That will be worse than any cell," Silas said, "and far more fitting." They led the old man out, and Cora, watching him go, waited to feel the thing she had spent so many cold nights imagining she would feel, the vindication, the sweetness of it. The moment where the ones who were so certain finally had to know they were wrong. It did not come, not the way she had pictured. What came instead was something quieter and stranger and far more her own. A kind of loosening, as though a hand that had been closed around her throat her whole life had, very slowly, opened. She did not need Thorn to suffer. She had thought she would. For years, in the leaking house on the edge of everything, she had thought that would be the shape of justice. But standing here, freed, seen, with a wolf at her side, and her own voice finally in her own mouth, she found she did not need him to suffer at all. She only needed to no longer be afraid of him. And she wasn't. That was the thing she carried out of that hall. Not the old man's downfall. Her own quiet, astonishing lack of fear. They gave her a room. It was warm. It was clean. There was a window that looked east over the tree line, toward the mountains, toward somewhere in all that white, a cave she would never quite stop thinking of. She stood in the middle of it for a long moment before she touched anything. The floor was stone, but there was a rug, worn soft in the center from years of feet. The bed had 2 blankets. 2. She stood and looked at the two blankets for longer than a person should look at blankets. She had slept under one thin one for so long that two felt like a question she did not know how to answer. The fire had already been lit. Someone had done that before she arrived, which meant someone had expected her to stay, which meant a decision about her life had been made, kindly, before anyone had thought to ask her what she wanted. Once, that would have frightened her. The old reflex was still there. The need to make herself small enough to fit whatever space she was allowed. The habit of gratitude so deep it bent into apology. She noticed the reflex, and then, very deliberately, she set it down. She was allowed to be here. Not because she had earned it by being small, not because she was useful, just because she was a person, and persons are allowed to be somewhere. She was still learning to believe that, but she was learning. The wolf followed her in without being asked. He checked the corners of the room with the seriousness of a professional, nosing along the walls, and then he lay down in front of the fire as though that had always been the plan. Cora watched him. "You could go anywhere in this whole place," she said. "You know that, right? You have a throne down there." "Sort of." The wolf opened one eye. "And you picked the rug in my room." He closed the eye. She sat down on the floor beside him, her back against his warm side, and looked out the window at the first stars coming up over the tree line. One at a time, the way they always did. The way they had come up over that same tree line every night for however long this place had stood here, whether anyone was watching or not. She had always liked that about stars. They did not need to be watched to do what they did. For most of her life, she had felt the opposite of a star, like she only existed in the moment someone happened to look, and vanished the rest of the time. She did not feel like that tonight. Tonight, she felt like she went on existing even when no one was looking. It was such a small thing. It changed everything. Silas came to her door that evening. He knocked. She noticed that. It would have been so easy for him not to. He was the lord of this place. Every door in it was, in some sense, already his. And he stood outside hers and knocked and waited and did not come in until she opened it. "Your hands," he said, when she did. She looked down at them. The cuts from the trap had scabbed over, faint red lines across 3 fingers of the right one, where the metal had caught. "They're healing," she said. "There's a healer here, I know. I can manage a cut." "I know you can." His mouth did something that was almost a smile. "I have watched you manage a great deal worse." He did not step inside. He stood in the doorway. This man who was also a wolf. This lord who had knelt on his own steps and set down 11 years of silence in front of his whole pack, and he looked almost uncertain. It undid something in her, seeing him uncertain. "I want to offer you restitution," he said. "The Western Pack will answer for what they did. That part is not in question." He paused. "But that is about them. What I am asking about is you. What you want. What you want." 3 words. She stood in the doorway and felt the whole strange weight of them, because no one had ever asked her that. Not once. Not in her entire life. Things had always been decided for her. The storeroom, the leaking house, the exile, the cloak with the wolf clasp that had nearly damned her in a hall full of strangers. Every door of her life had been opened and closed by other hands. And here was a man asking her, quietly, in a warm doorway, what she wanted. She thought about it honestly. She owed the question that much. "I've wanted very little, for a very long time," she said slowly. "A roof that didn't leak. Work that got paid fairly. Someone to eat a meal with, now and then." She almost laughed at how small the list was. "I never let myself want past that. Wanting past that was how you got hurt. And now?" "Now," she turned the word over. "Now I don't know. That's the honest answer. I've never had to choose before. I don't know the shape of my own wanting yet." She looked up at him. "Is that allowed? To not know?" "Yes," he said, and there was something in his voice, low and sure. "It's allowed. Take the time." "Can I stay while I figure it out?" "You can stay." Neither of them said anything about what it might mean, that his wolf had chosen her doorway, that he had knelt on his own steps in front of his whole pack. Both of them knew. Both of them let it sit, unspoken, gentle. Some things do not need to be said on the first night. The weeks that followed, she learned the place the way she had learned everywhere, carefully, from the outside in, the kitchen first, because that was where she could be useful, and useful was a language she spoke fluently. The head cook was a broad, sharp woman named Della, who had strong opinions about bread and shared them without being asked, and who put Cora to work without prying into where she'd come from. At the end of each week, Della pressed coin into her hand. Fair coin, honest coin. Cora folded it into the lining of her mended cloak and tried not to count it too often. She had never in her life been paid fairly for a thing. It sat strangely in her hands, that coin, like proof of something she had been told her whole life wasn't true, that her work had worth, that her hours mattered, that she was not simply tolerated, but valued. She cried the first time, a little, folding that coin away, not from sadness, from the strangeness of being treated as though she counted. The eastern courtyard next, because the wolf used it in the mornings, and she had started going wherever he went without quite noticing when she'd started. They would sit out there in the pale early light, the two of them, and she would drink something warm Della had pressed on her, and the wolf would lie with his heeled legs stretched out, and sometimes Nathan would come and sit with them. Nathan talked more now, not a great deal, but more. The frost that had grown over him for years was thawing, slow, one word at a time, and Cora understood without being told that she'd had something to do with it. That in giving his brother back to him, she had loosened something in Nathan too. "He used to laugh," Nathan said to her once, watching Silas cross the courtyard. "Before. You'd have liked him. The before him." "I like the now him," Cora said. Nathan looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I think that's rather the point of you." She didn't know what to say to that. So she didn't say anything. She just sat in the pale light with a wolf on one side and a slowly healing man on the other, and let herself be somewhere she was wanted. The library last, because it took her 2 full weeks to work up to it. She had never been in a room with that many books. She stood in the doorway a long time the first day, and then went back to the kitchen without going in, her heart beating like she'd nearly done something forbidden. The second time, she made it 3 steps inside. The third time, she found a chair by the window and sat in it for an hour and did not read a single word. Just sat there, among all those books, getting slowly used to the impossible idea that she was allowed, that no one was going to come and tell her, A wolfless nobody had no business among the things that mattered. Silas found her there one afternoon. He had a book under his arm and the look of a man expecting an empty room. She started to stand, the old reflex, making space, making herself easy to remove. "Don't," he said. He sat in the chair across from hers. He opened his book. He read, and she sat in hers. Among the books she was allowed to be near, and neither of them said anything for a long time. It was the most comfortable she had ever been inside four walls. She noticed that, and this time she did not set it aside into the pile of things too frightening to look at. She let herself have it. Let herself sit in a warm room across from a man who knocked on doors, surrounded by things she was allowed to touch, and be, for one quiet hour, simply content. She was learning that too. That contentment did not have to be stolen, or braced against, or paid for in advance. That sometimes you were just allowed to have it. 3 weeks in, she woke one morning knowing she needed to go back to the cave. She could not have said why that morning and not another. She only knew it, the way she knew storm signs, the way she knew certain things in her body before her mind caught up. She got up. She dressed. She went to find the wolf. He was already waiting by the eastern gate, as though he'd known before she did, and Silas was there too. She hadn't asked him. He had simply appeared in a plain dark coat with no markings of rank, carrying nothing but a small folding knife that he turned over in his fingers as they walked, without seeming to notice he was doing it. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it. The way back was easier than the way out had been. No storm now, no exile, no half-frozen stumbling through the dark. Just a clear, cold morning, and snow that crunched clean underfoot, and a wolf trotting slightly ahead of them the way he did when he decided something was his idea. She let him have it. The vines at the cave mouth were the same. Inside, the fire pit. The stacked wood she had left against the wall, dry for whoever came next. The dry ground where she had spent 3 days keeping a fire going for an animal that had tried to bite her when she first reached for the iron. She sat down in the same spot. The wolf lay down across the cave mouth, the way he used to when the storm was bad, and she had asked him once, half joking, if he could block some of the wind. He had. Cora looked around the small stone space for a long while, and she thought about the woman who had sat here not so long ago, too tired to cry, too cold to think past the next hour, talking to a wolf because there was no one else in the whole world, and because silence had started to feel like just another name for giving up. The woman who had sat here before had been keeping a fire alive out of pure refusal to die. The woman sitting here now was keeping nothing alive. She was just sitting in a place that had once been the whole thin edge of her survival, and was now only a quiet room in the mountains where something important had happened to her. That was the change. Not that the cave had healed her. Caves do not heal anyone, but that she no longer needed it to. She had somewhere else to be warm now. She had people who knocked before they entered and coin that was fairly hers, and a voice that carried across a hall full of strangers. And she had come back anyway, not to survive it this time, just to see it, just to sit in it, just to be the woman who lived in the place she had almost died. Silas sat down against the far wall, giving her room, watching her with those pale gold eyes that she now knew belonged to both the man and the wolf, and had all along. "You know what I figured out?" she said. He waited. "Everyone's going to say he's the wolf who stayed." She nodded at the great white shape across the cave mouth. "That's how the story will get told. The loyal wolf. The one who stayed by the outcast woman." She tilted her head. "But he didn't stay. Not really. He left. That last morning. He walked out of here without a word and didn't look back." The wolf opened one eye. "I'm the one who stayed," Cora said, and her voice, when she said it, was not small. It was not careful. It was not the voice of a woman making herself easy to overlook. It was steady and clear and entirely her own. "I stayed through the storm. I stayed when he left. I stayed with myself all those years when everyone else walked away, and the only company I had was a word they'd hung on me." She looked at the fire pit, cold now, that she had once kept burning with bleeding hands. "The wolf who stayed. That title's mine. I earned it. Every cold night of it." The wolf got up. He crossed the cave, slow, and he lay down beside her, his back against her side, and he looked out at the cave mouth the way he had on that last morning. The same posture, but everything about it was different. That morning, he had been watching the storm end, gathering himself to leave. This time, he was just there, not leaving, not bracing to leave, just resting his warm weight against her, in a cave that was no longer a place of exile, but a place they had chosen, together, to come back to. She leaned into him. He was warm. He was still. Outside, the trees stood quiet under their weight of snow, and the light came pale and clean through the vines, and somewhere across the small space, Silas watched the two of them with a look on his worn face that she was only just learning to read. It was not the look of a man who saw a weapon. It was not the look of a pack that saw a curse. It was the look of someone who saw her, all of her, the scars and the small, careful habits and the stubborn voice she was only just learning to use, and found in all of it nothing to look away from. She stayed a long time. When she finally stood to go, she looked down at the wolf. He was already on his feet, already waiting, but this time he did not walk out ahead of her. This time he went to the mouth of the cave, and he stopped, and he looked back at her, waiting. "Ready?" she said, and he did not turn and vanish into the white the way he had before. He stood in the cave mouth, holding it open, holding the whole bright morning open, and he waited for her to walk through it first. Cora crossed the cave. She stepped out into the clean, cold light, with a wolf on one side and a man on the other, and a mended cloak around her shoulders, and coin she had earned folded into the lining, and a voice in her chest that was quiet no longer. She had walked out of a gate once, into a storm, alone, because people who were certain about her had decided she should die. She walked out of this cave into the light, chosen and seen and unafraid, because that was the difference in the end. Not that someone had finally come to save her, but that she had stopped waiting to be saved and started at long last to believe she was worth staying for, herself most of all. And here, quietly, is the thing worth carrying away from a story like this one. The world is very quick to hang a word on a person. Cursed, worthless, too much, not enough. It hands out these words carelessly, often to the young, often to the ones who cannot yet argue back. And the cruelest part is not the word itself. It is the day the person starts to believe it, Cora's whole long healing was not really about a wolf, or a lord, or a great stone hall. Those were only the places it happened to happen. It was about the slow, stubborn work of taking back a voice that had been talked over her whole life, of learning that dignity is not something a crowd grants you, and so it is not something a crowd can take away. Of discovering that the ones the world throws out are so often the ones who, in the freezing dark, stop to save a life. She stopped for a wolf in a trap when it would have been easier to walk on, and in the end, that same refusal to walk on was what she finally learned to offer herself. She stayed, for a wolf, for a stranger, and at long last, for the woman she had been all along, underneath the word, the one who was always, always worth staying for.